Welcome to For the Purpose Of, the podcast where we navigate the intersection of technology and the world of education. I'm Sarah Wood, and I'm joined today by
Keith Tramper.
And I'm Ron Houtman. So today we're going to be talking about a book that has been making the airwaves. And, usually when you start hearing about a book a lot, it's because they're trying to sell a book. So they try to appear on every podcast, news station, etc. So this book is called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And this is by Jonathan Haidt. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. It's an interesting book, and I'm going to ascribe part of this to my favorite words lately, moral panic. So, Keith, what's our question of the podcast?
The question for today is, what's your favorite creation tool that you're using lately? And Sarah, let's start with you.
So I live in that Canva space like all the time, but I love when I can take that digital creation kind of offline, I guess you'll say a little bit. But I've been doing a lot of 3D printing lately. I have a Voxel Aquila C2 3D printer at home that I got on a killer Prime Day deal.
Well, that just rolled right off your tongue, didn't it?
When you live in that world. But specifically, one thing I've noticed, the more 3D printing I do, I don't want to call myself a filament snob, but there are definitely brands of filament that work better with specific 3D printers or for specific types of things that you're printing. And I guess I've been living in that 3D printing world lately because I've been doing a lot of geocaching, and I've actually been 3D printing geocaches. So the filament that I'm choosing is the Polymaker brand filament. It just seems to hold up great outdoors in different weather conditions. It's beautiful when I put my 3D print through my slicer. I get a nice clean finish. So I've been doing that. And if you have a 3D printer and don't have one, I highly recommend one of those magnetic flex bases. So you don't have that solid hard base in it. Your prints you can do without having a brim or a raft, and they just come out so much cleaner. So that's where I've been living lately. How about you, Keith?
And if you don't know what a brim and a raft are, that's okay.
Yes.
That means you haven't been getting as nerdy with 3D printing as I also have been using my 3D printer like nonstop lately. You all know I love gardening, and it's seed starting season, right? So I had built this whole like seed starting shelf out of PVC pipe and set up all these sensors and stuff to kind of help them get growing well. But I have a 3D printer now, so I started 3D printing parts that would kind of manage the wiring and hold the different sensors in place. And that has been a lot of fun designing that. I use a lot of Tinkercad to build that, playing around with some other design tools too. But the 3D printer has been indispensable this year. And I too, I don't know if I'm a filament snob, but I've definitely learned the difference between PLA, PLA Plus, and PLA Pro. I have like one of each right now that I print with, and you can tell the difference in the way that they print. Ron, what about you?
Not to be the 3-play triple deal here, but yeah, my 3D printer. I would say it's, for a 3D printer or having a 3D printer, it is useful, especially when you don't want to drive to the hardware store. So when something breaks or you just need a little, because there's, unfortunately, plastic is everywhere and it's not ever going to stop being everywhere. So every once in a while, I'll just have stuff that is integral to the product inside the house that'll break. And for the most part, I can go find the same thing because other people got upset about it too and modeled it and created it and shared it on one of the many 3D sites. So mine is mostly to do house repairs, especially thinking about how much plastic is in everything that we own.
Yeah, I think about it as like when that thing breaks, that plastic thing breaks, you're actually doing the world better by not replacing the entire item that's mostly made of plastic, and you're just printing a tiny little part that just needed a little bit of fixing. So,
yep.
I've seen a lot of videos too where people will take like 2-liter plastic bottles and cut them down into like threads and turn it into filament. And I'm like, what a great way to just not put something in the landfill if you don't recycle.
Yeah, right now you mean, not in the landfill right now.
Correct. It's all about
Right.
timing.
Yeah. So I recently had some work done on my deck, and I was just, as I was outside looking at it, I was like, that Trex or, composite deck material, I think this is going to be around like when the space alien archaeologists come and unveil us or whatever, figure out what happened to us. And they're going to find all these decks all over the place.
Stand the test of time.
Yep.
Feeling burned out from staring at screens? Us too. That doesn't mean you have to miss out on the latest tech for your classroom. This summer, ditch the stuffy conference halls and join us for the Touch Some Grass Technology Conference. The Touch Some Grass Technology Conference is your chance to dive into technology trends in a beautiful outdoor setting. Imagine learning about coding under the shade of a tree, or diving into a book about AI with a gentle breeze in your hair. Connect and collaborate with fellow educators and brainstorm new ideas for your classroom with a fresh perspective. Spark new ideas and tap into creativity under the open sky. Explore the power of choice-based learning through engaging activities designed for all types of learners. Find the perfect tools and resources to transform your classroom, no matter your teaching style. The Touch Some Grass Technology Conference. Step away from the ordinary and step into a world of learning, connection, and fresh air. Visit Ken ISD's Learning Stream to register. Spots are limited, so don't delay.
Hello, PDX listeners. We hope you've enjoyed this season of For the Purpose Of. We're excited to bring you more in Season 4. Remember that all responses for Podcast PDX are due May 31st, so we can report your sketch credit. Get your responses in now for any episodes you still want credit for. Watch for a survey to follow this episode to help us steer the direction of next year's Podcast PDX. What are the things you'd like us to talk about? What do you wish we did differently? We want to know. Finally, make sure you sign up for next year's Podcast PDX at bit.ly/PDX24-register. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this year. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
All right, so we're going to transition over into our current topic, as we talked about, or I did right at the beginning of the show, about a new book called The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And that is a long title. So this is by Jonathan Haidt. He's a renowned social psychologist, and he makes a pretty startling claim, kind of that the rise of smartphones and social media, coupled with overprotective parenting, has triggered a mental health crisis among today's youth. So he paints a pretty dire picture of the generation among us right now, that they're being rewired by technology. So the book itself, if you've not heard or seen it, we would urge you just to go and hit the usual places to go look at reviews of the book, or maybe a few internal pages. But some reviewers are saying that Haidt rightfully sounds the alarm on the disturbing trends of anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts spiking among our adolescents, especially teen girls. But others accuse him of grossly oversimplifying the complex issues that are causing mental illness and demonizing technology. We've seen lots of that in the last, since technology has existed, back to the days of cell phones and pagers are going to kill us all in our schools, but that I don't think happened either. So we're going to unpack just a little bit of Haidt's central arguments that he has in the evidence, and also explore kind of the pushback about his proposed solution is banning smartphones for kids under 16. So that's an interesting thing to think about too. And then we'll look at some alternative perspectives, or maybe calling for more, as we like on our podcast, a more nuanced, multifaceted approach to things, instead of, we'll talk about a little bit, moral panics. That thing is bad and it's going to kill us all eventually. So it's pretty fascinating and it's pretty polarizing. We hope you enjoy just a few thoughts that we have about this topic. Sarah?
So I think we're kind of in a unique position in the fact that our jobs require us to be living in that technology world, staying up to date on trends and things, and seeing connections for educators and for students. And I think at the end of the day, really, we always come back to, we're preparing for students for jobs that don't exist today. So, like, how can we leverage technology, especially now with the rise in AI, but still, like, allow kids to be kids? I think back to, like, when we were children, we've been having these conversations with my own kiddos at home. Like, it was very common. Like, we would have breakfast, we'd chill at home doing something, and by like 10 o'clock, we were gone, maybe coming home for a sandwich at lunch, and then guessing when dinner was going to be back around. And our parents never knew where we were. Like, we'd be out riding bikes, exploring things and stuff like that. But I think what that brings me back to is just like, we were outside. And I think that was the key. And that's kind of what over time that is getting lost in the fact that we do have some of these amazing technologies and advancements and things like that, but just like how important it is to be outside just for your overall physical and mental wellness. And I think that we kind of need to put a focus back on that. Shameless plug for Touch Some Grass coming up this summer for outdoor learning for teachers.
Hey, Sarah, I just wondering,
Mm-hmm.
you just talked about outside playing when you were small, just like I did, and I'm sure Keith did too. As you know, we'd be gone all day, and we had a neighborhood dinner bell that we would have to come home to. I mean, it was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
We had that too.
We're just wondering, sir. So, just thinking about then versus now, do we think that if you let your kids be more free range kids, that one of us might end up being investigated by Child Protective Services? That's my wondering, because I just remember growing up, we were outside all the time. But when I look at my neighborhood around me, I rarely see kids going further than their driveway and running around outside. I just wonder, what do you guys think about that? Is why that's a thing?
I think in my particular situation as a parent and where we live, we are very fortunate to be at the end of a cul-de-sac. And we have several families with kiddos around. And especially when my kids were younger, like, we all had eyes on them, but they would just go from yard to yard running feral in the streets. Like, and just, we knew who to contact. If something came about, and like, because we would always have eyes on the neighborhood, because I mean, we're at the end of a circle, we would recognize if there were different cars that were coming there, because we don't get through traffic. So it's kind of a different situation. But I think if we were a little bit more open, like, I think there would definitely be more caution. I feel like there's safety in the environment that you've created and cultivated within your neighborhood around that.
Yeah, I'll second that. And as a parent of young kids, I think so much of it depends on how much you trust your neighborhood, right? The people around you and how well connected you are with them. And I think that looks a lot different these days because we're much more packed together, right? There's a lot more population in a much smaller space, but we're also connected digitally. Like, people are at our fingertips. Anytime we need to connect with another parent, we can shoot a text, or, it doesn't have to be a phone call or a walk down to somebody's house or any of that stuff. We're not ringing a dinner bell anymore. We're sending a text message to to our kids or to some parents that are nearby.
Yeah. And for the older, I mean, I have a 15 and 12-year-old. I kick them outside still. And my daughter does have a phone, and there was a lot that went into getting that responsibility and, knowing that that can be taken away at any given time. But I mean, we as a family, we use Life 360 too, as another thing. So like, we always know where they're at. I learned recently that a lot of my daughter's friends, their families also use Life 360. So now all the friends are also sharing their locations with one another. So they're keeping tabs on each other at all times. So not only like what you were saying, Keith, like, we are connected, at the fingertip, you can send a text, like, they can just simply open an app and see where people are. So it just kind of shows some of that change that's happened over time.
I think it's a big change then from, in Haidt's book, he talks a lot about risk-taking behaviors, which causes a lot of growth in our kids. One of our big goals that we have of our kids are to become independent adults at some time, right? So he's posited in the book too that the amount of technology, mostly smartphones, are really causing, for example, like teenage boys having fewer broken bones compared to before 2010. I mean, I don't know if I think that's a good thing to have fewer broken bones, but really the research was just pointing to less risky behavior. You think about tracking me as I'm a kid. Man, now I got to come back and answer you about like why I was over that one girl's house, and I don't want you to know that. I want to have a life, maybe as a young adult, of exploration without so much oversight or so much surveillance over me. So that's one of those, and I get both sides of this, from the kid side and from the adult side, is that I am responsible for you, so I don't get dragged into court. And from the kid side is like I want to figure out how everything works out there and who I am and what I'm doing every day. So I know it's a big struggle, and it's talked about in the book quite a bit. In those kind of cases, is that where's that balance between the surveillance state of your child and free ranging, trying to get back to, I think we called it the play-based childhood, as it was described in the book too. Those are those things we're thinking of. But again, the technology has changed around us. Like you said, Sarah, we've got all these apps that we can track our kids. But
yeah, as I was thinking about preparing for our podcast today, I was thinking like, okay, so put myself in the mind of my 10-year-old self. When I would go outside, what would be the first thing that I would do? It was always like, I remember this, like taking that big deep breath, smelling the outdoors, and like that would kind of determine what you would do. Like if it had rained previously and you smelled worms, you're not going to play in the grass,
you want to bet?
or maybe you're pulling the worms out of the grass. I don't know, but I just think that it was a sense, not necessarily just taking that deep breath and, smelling in the fresh air and whatnot, but all the opportunity that posed for you when you were in that moment. And I was looking through some articles, searching for some data, and it just really reminded me too, like all the great things that come from that unstructured play that come from being outside, the responsibility that comes with that. I mean, like I obviously mentioned, like the physical part of that, but like you're forced to be creative with what you have available to you instead of having the internet at your fingertips and getting lost because you're mindlessly doing whatever with cat videos,
Wait, are you watching what I'm watching right now?
I figured that's what you were watching.
Oh, well, actually, there's a cat in a box back here because that's where cats go. Yeah. So Keith, just wondering too, as you think about this, I know you think about screen time a lot, and in the book, that's another big point in the book of just how much time is occupied by our teenagers with having a portable black rectangle in their hand, staring at it all the time, like all continuously, not looking up. So what do you think about when you're thinking about screen time for our kids? Is this just an evolution we used to think people like me and maybe Sarah, when we just sit in a corner and read books for hours on end, we were they never really said like, you're reading too much. But when I have a phone, when I have a smartphone, am I not reading?
Yeah. I think this has been an ongoing debate for many years, and one that I've tried to follow pretty closely. And sort of where I've settled on this is the idea of quality over quantity, right? It's not that their face is in a screen, it's what their face is doing on that screen, what they're engaging with. And in my own parenting with my kids, we try to break it down into 3 categories. Like the things you're doing online are either educational, or they're creative and inspiring, or they're entertainment, right? So the educational stuff is your how to draw a Pokemon, right? Or here's how to fix this part of your car, even, or how to garden, right? I look at a ton of those videos, and I don't think anybody would debate that those are not valid uses of time. I think it depends on what the rest of the world is doing sometimes, right? It's that whole going back to your debate about the book at inappropriate times, right? If it's removing you from social situations, then maybe it is an issue. But the other side is like that creative and inspiring. Just like my daughter's really into those videos where it's like, whoa, they made that thing, or that was so cool. I think of like Mark Rober for that. He's also educational in a lot of cases, but like, filling an entire swimming pool with Orbeez, right? Okay, that's cool, creative, and definitely inspiring. It's kind of cool to see what people can do and come up with when they have nearly unlimited budgets. And and entertainment side of things, that's your typical, like, I think of any YouTuber or anything you're doing that just kind of makes you laugh or even steals your attention. So trying to find a balance between those and not leaning entirely into the entertainment realm, I think is a good way to look at it.
Yeah, I think, again, Sarah and you have both talked about balance, right? So this is the thing that I always think about when any of these stories come out about the moral panics, like Jonathan Haidt has talked about. I'm not going to say that he's cherry picking data, but I think there's some omission that is occurring when you start to think about, when you want to sell a book, you have to write it to have, just like a Twitter post, it has to be outrageous to get people to buy your thing. So I was thinking about this, like the techno panics that we've had and just regular panics. There's been a few of these that I don't know a lot of us really remember. I remember a lot of this from, history class way back when. I did a couple other searches. I was thinking, what are the other things that are really, that we tend to freak out about? I don't mean, any particular person. I just mean the royal we. So Socrates, way back when, he faulted writing for weakening the necessity for the power of memory. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, way back then,
Yeah.
everything was that oral tradition. If you think about in probably the year 1440 or so, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. There was a ton of moral panics after the printing press came out. The scribes who used to scribe the Bible, and church officials were really concerned that the masses would be able to read the Bible and bypass them as the arbiters of the information that was being conveyed in the Bible. So you just got bypassed. They didn't like that. I think, there's just been a few of these things, even like when sewing machines came out, there was some moral panics that would cause unemployment of seamstresses. Yeah, well, hopefully that would get them away from doing that to other work, right? Or what kind of work that they might want to do. So we've seen this over and over and over again. I think the latest one that we have right now, what is our current moral panic besides smartphones with kids? It's about AI, right? So everybody's talking about AI is going to have some doomsday scenario, that, who knows, large scale societal risks will take place and it's going to kill us. So I think the point of this is, as you come across books like Jonathan Haidt's book, where he's really proposing some pretty wild stuff, I'll give you one. He's the conclusion of the book. This is the so you don't have to TLDR. Was it TLDR? Too long, didn't read.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. For everybody, he's proposed 4 norms for schools as solutions to this problem of so much anxiety. So the first one is no smartphones before high school. That's one. Probably see that. No social media accounts are allowed until you're 16 years old. And, we already have some laws about 13, which is never enforced anyway. So, yeah, I don't know how you would make that work. That's a hard one. I really do agree with this one to some point, which is he advocates for phone-free schools. So we know from reading different things, and we do have a couple schools in our area that actually are phone-free. and some anecdotal evidence that the kids feel like they're not always having to compete for attention or stars or likes or whatever. It decreases that, I think is the word FOMO, maybe fear of missing out. So, I don't know if you need to have phone-free schools. I would like to have probably periods of time where you earn the ability to use your phone, maybe in passing time or lunch or whatever. But we've seen too, a lot of the conflict that we're seeing, amongst kids is carried through social media accounts or whatever and shared that way. So that's another consideration. And last thing he talks about is just more real world play and independence, which I think we can agree with. So when I read the book, my I was like, man, so much of this stuff is so hyperbolic, not really supported by broad research. It's really small amounts of small sample size and pulling out and cherry picking in my mind versus other research that I've been reading about kids and cell phones and all that. But the 4 points were pretty balanced, I thought, do we really need to have kids that have smartphones when you can strap an Apple Watch on them to track them? Social media, you can go both ways and say, is it a good or a bad thing? To me, I'm leaning much more to the algorithmic feeds that we all get instead of the chronological feeds are much more terrible. But phone lesson schools, probably a good idea. And I think more real world stuff and more independence is good. So what do you guys think about those points though?
So there's a lot in there that I'd like to respond to. The first is, I think you went through a few technologies that have been introduced over time and how that was sort of pushed back against by the dominant culture. One activity I really love to do with people is to imagine when a technology was introduced. And I might have talked about this on the podcast before, but I like to use the bow and arrow as a technology. And when that was introduced, how did that affect society? Can you imagine what it would have been like? What was hunting or even warfare, I guess, at that point before the bow and arrow kind of came out? What did that mean for people? And then after that came out, how did that change the nature of hunting and warfare? We moved away from trapping. We moved away from hand-to-hand combat, right? So it's just an interesting thought experiment. And what I've landed on is that every technology, regardless of what it is, highly technical or very basic, everything has a push and pull. They have something that pushes us apart socially and something that pulls us together. So it's just a way to look at technology. And I think mobile devices or cell phones are kind of that same thing. There are some things it does that pushes us apart, and there are some things that pull us together. There's a lot of good that comes from having a mobile device, but there's also some harm that comes from that too. So, and as far as like the banning of mobile devices goes, or apps even, right? Like banning TikTok is a big thing right now in the news. I think there's evidence to show that a lot of times banning isn't super effective. Obviously, in a school, you have a little bit more control if it's an all or nothing policy, right? So I do see the positives that come out of that. But a lot of times, especially with apps, banning an app or banning AI, they're not effective. Kids have way more time than we do to figure out ways to go around the safeguards we put in place. So I think we spend a lot of time focusing our energy on banning and making and enforcing that rather than trying to get at the root of the problem or trying to help students navigate, build those skills for when it's appropriate to have this out. When can you use it for learning and really leveraging them in the classroom? So I go back and forth with whether it's a good idea to ban it in the schools or if it's a good idea to leverage them and build those skills within school. I get that it's a very complex issue, but
Keith, as you were talking there, it made me think of a lesson that I would do kind of at the beginning of the year with students, very introductory, usually with kindergarten or first grade. We would look at images of different things and we talk about, is it a technology or is it not a technology? And a lot of times our students today think like it has to be electrical, it has to be plugged in and things like that. But I was like, believe it or not, this image that shows a piece of paper and a pencil was groundbreaking technology back in the day. And then we talk about what technology is. And, essentially it's anything that makes a process or a system easier to do or accomplish a task. And so when you compare that paper and pencil versus like a tablet and a stone and a hammer, yes, that was groundbreaking and that made a difference. And so I think then what always comes back to with all that is engaging in conversation, not losing that human element, which we talk a lot about with AI, and is jumping to banning the thing that we need to do because we're not willing to engage in civil conversation and discourse around specific topics, or we feel so held to our beliefs where, this is the way it should be done. But I think it just really, we need to bring back that human element, that empathy, and seeing other people's point of views, being willing to talk about it, and then making whether they be house rules or things that we share with others, just like I think that, these are really good guidelines to follow, and maybe not necessarily jumping to banning right away. And I think one of the things that I keep on hearing over and over, because teachers are having so many behavior issues that are coming up in the classroom, and teachers are quick to receive the blame for that, where it honestly, it starts at home. How are you kind of engaging in these discussions at home with your kiddos over things that aren't related to school or technology? And what are your expectations that are at home? And if you can have like a sound base at home of what's expected as part of being a good functioning human that contributes to the betterment of society, that you don't necessarily maybe need to jump to banning everything.
One of the authors that I follow is Anya Kamenetz, who writes about screen time. And, her work has shifted a lot after the pandemic happened, and screen time became like a much bigger thing where people kind of went, I can't do anything but give my kids more screen time. And I'm very privileged that before I had the ability to monitor that and balance that for them. But one of her quotes was, I believe it's our job to enhance the good for our kids, even when we mitigate the bad. And more than that, to remain open to learning what our children's media interests have to teach us. And I just think that's such a powerful thing, that we can mitigate the bad and lift up the good and empower the good and give our kids that space to live in it. But we also have that responsibility to try to understand and to listen to them and keep an open mind about how they're using technology. I know we talked about play earlier, but with play, yes, I will never dispute the fact that going outside is really important and getting away from screens is really important too. But I think the way that play looks today is much different than what we grew up in, right? There are a lot more ways that, yes, technology is here. I think of video games a lot for this. And I'm not just talking video games on the Xbox. I'm talking mobile phones too, right? Playing Words with Friends is a way to connect with people, right? Or getting on and playing Fortnite with friends is a huge deal. Even people that are outside of your community. I think it brings up
just go play Pokemon.
Yeah, that gives a little bit of a combination of both, right? Going out in the real world and hunting down gyms. But I want to emphasize that point that we need to listen to the kids too. We need to know not just what they're doing, but why it's important to them, and just be reasonable with what we expect of them in those spaces, right? We don't want to take away all the good just because there's a bad thing within that, right?
Yep. And a lot of times that bad thing is overhyped by somebody someplace, right? That's really kind of the point of when you're balancing what Jonathan Haidt has said in the book. Again, is very much moral panicking on a couple places here. So as we wrap this up, something for you as our audience really to think about for our PDX group also. So Haidt really focuses so heavily on the idea of the smartphone and social media as driving forces We kind of wonder too, what are some other potential, I would say, contributing forces to youth anxiety, depression, and mental struggles that we're seeing that need attention and solutions? And how can communities of practice, like in education, address some issues like the academic pressure that they might feel, or social isolation, or trauma that they've gone through? That's what we'd like you to think about, as you start seeing this book and maybe other counter articles and books to what we've seen and talked about here. So we think it's pretty important, again, because our main concern as educators and working in education is really, our kids. So how are we creating places and spaces for them to get to where they want to get to, versus where I want to get to as an adult for them? It's really about them and the choices in their trajectory of where they want to be in the future. All right, with that, thanks everybody for listening to this episode of For the Purpose Of. We really appreciate you subscribing to our podcast. And if you like this podcast, we'd love to have you share it with a friend or give it a nice 5-star rating on your favorite pod-catching app or podcast directory. We'd love to see that feedback, and it helps us share this podcast with other people also.
And this conversation, I'm sure, brought up different ideas and beliefs that you hold. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the things that we shared or the things that we saw in the books, or even some of the things we'll drop in the show notes that kind of give different perspectives on the issues we talked about here. So please, reach out to us at edtech@kentisd.org, and we always welcome your feedback. You can reach out and find all things edtech at bit.ly/IamEdTech. We'll catch you next time on For the Purpose Of.
This podcast is a service of Kent ISD, produced by Ron Houtman, Sarah Wood, and Keith Tramper, and edited by Keith Tramper. Our theme music is Neon Nights by Scott Holmes Music, and our ad music is Vienna Beat by Blue Dot Sessions.
Bingo!
You gotta do the dance with it.
What's going on?